Hi everyone, this is Xiang. So it's my great pleasure for giving a talk. You might not be able to see me because it turns out there's some technical difficulties for the camera to work, but I think you should see my screen fine. So I'm gonna share with you today about some of our recent research work in University of Southern California Natural Language Processing Group about how to make this training and maintaining of natural language processing or NLP systems to be in a more responsible and data efficient way. And the reason for me to dive into this research direction is like I've been talking a lot with these practitioners in the industry when they are trying to deploy different NLP system into practical uses. And they've always been having these like frustrations of maintaining the system to the emergent data streams they've been handling. And we've been seeing so much good performance on the academic benchmark, but then it always kind of have a gaps to the real world performance. All right. So to start with, I want to share with you what I've been observing as a really kind of a surprisingly simple recipe these days used in the building NLP system in both academia and in this industry. So it turns out that there are three main elements here. One is this choosing a model architecture, and nowadays we more often talking about some specific type of deep neural networks like transformer architecture. And there's a way, and there's a process of collecting your in-domain annotated data. Usually this was done by a specific process of creating guidelines of what things to annotate and to really provide tutorials to these human annotators to do these things in a more precise way. And then you get a data set where then you would take this data set and model together and put it into some computing resources to run and produce a trend model, which you can be deployed to your online services and so. Right, and in this process, we find that the model architectures actually become more like a commodity thing where there's actually many very good open source libraries of different neural network architectures like Hugging Face, for example, where like in those using those libraries, it's really easy to switch from a model architecture A to a model architecture B, probably just like a switch a line of code kind of effort. So that becomes really very accessible and really transferable. And then if you're looking at the computing power, it's also really just maybe changing a line of code things that you can really expand your experiment environments or like your deployment environments from a few GPUs to tens or hundreds of more GPUs to really make the things scale up. So among what is left here is the label data, which becomes really a tricky problem for many of the researchers and practitioners, because this seems to be the thing that we have to customize and have to have very specific solutions when we're switching between different problem domains and data domains, right? So then we really think that the model architecture and computing power these days are more transferable, while this label data is not. And just to give you a bit more a sense about why the label data is so challenging for people, we can look at the example here, which is the relation extraction task. And this task is basically asking the model to look through a sentence, for example, and then trying to understand the type of relationships between two given entities in that sentence. And here you can see the Billy Mays is a person name and Tampere is a city. And then the sentence is actually describing that this person was found dead in that city on a Sunday. So the type of relations between this person and location is actually the city of death, for example. And there's a TACRED data set being recently created specifically to capture such a nature of the task relation extraction. And the creators for that data set actually spend I would say over 100 hours and be hiring a lot of human annotators on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and actually create data sets of a size about like 100 thousand label sentences for 41 different relation types. And they actually been doing this in a very careful way, such that they try to create this questionnaire to reduce the possible time you have to spend on annotating such a task. For example, if you look at these questions in a little bit more details, they actually provide some recommendations of these relations you can possibly have for this particular instance, because they have been running some background model to make a primitive predictions as example. So that actually reduced the annotator's time a lot. But eventually, when we are trying to just revisit how much they have been spent on just creating such a data set, it's actually a lot, right? Like if you look at the average cost per instance is like $50, and for the entire data set, it's like over 50,000. And the time cost they spend on these data sets is over a week, around like 20 seconds per instance. And that's just for this relatively simple natural language processing task that we're talking about. And if you're looking at more broadly at like more complex NLP tasks, for example, like the reading comprehension problem here, as exemplified by Squad, it's actually taken even more cost in terms of both the average time cost per instance and the average money spent on annotating an instance. Because in this case, you have to ask the annotator to read through a long passage to understand every single sentence in that passage. So you have a story on top of your mind, and then you are asking them to come up some questions that you can ask on top of this passage and get answer. So that's a more creative and more long form kind of process, which definitely will be more time consuming. Right. So this is the problem, right? We have so much difficulty, and it's time consuming as well, and it's actually expensive when creating these label data sets at scale for different NLP tasks. So there must be work that looking at some workarounds for reducing the size of the data sets, annotated data sets we really need, but still producing a fairly good model in terms of their final performance when deployed. So there are some efforts, for example, like multitask learning and transfer learning, both of which are actually looking at some similar data sets, existing ones that are out there, where you can maybe learn something, learn some similar skills from those publicly released and free data sets, so that you can do a little bit better on your target task. For example, there might be some other relation extraction data sets that's been created in the past decades, looking at a different subset of relation types, but we think that maybe learning from these data sets could be beneficial when we are building a slightly different relation extraction system. But the problem is that there's too much assumptions for how these transfer learning and multitask learning algorithms to work, right? And particularly, they have a strong assumption about these data distributions between the source data sets that you are used for free versus the target data sets that you actually are building a model for. If they are not close enough, then this kind of a multitask learning and transfer learning might bring you more harms than benefits, right? And that's really hard to measure given the current technique we have to understand like whether the gap is small enough or is actually too big to be used. And there's also active learning that involve human in the loop when creating annotations or label data. And they're trying to prioritize these non-label instances in a certain order, such that if you have done some similar annotation before, I can just avoid giving you something that are too similar, because that might be a repeating effort for the human annotator. Again, the problem about all of these methods from another perspective is that they are all been still focusing on creating annotations in a form of like instant and label kind of pairs. And the point we are trying to argue about this whole existing effort is that if you only give a label, let's say if I tell you this is a pair of entities in the sentence that express, let's say, the city of death kind of relations, I'm actually telling you very limited information, because as a human, when I'm learning a task, they not only just understand the final outcome or the final label that you are looking at, they're also trying to understand why you make such a prediction or decisions behind just understanding the final outcome, right? So I'm gonna dive into that point a bit more in the later slides, but another way we can think about a challenge here is that is bringing more label data is the only solution, or is actually the optimal solutions we can think of here. And I'm trying to say actually there's more issues we should care about than just increasing the size of the label data. And the one thing I want to touch on is the bias or the spiral patterns that possibly could be learned by the model, and that issues would eventually still exist even when you're increasing the amount of label data for your model training process, right? So we've been done a very interesting project on actually creating a classifier on tweets to detect whether the tweet is expressing some hateful sentiments or hateful contents towards certain social group. For example, like if you see a tweet talking about like something we hate Jews, then the a label supposed to be like hateful content for these particular tweets. And the way people have been building this kind of classifiers is just to fine tune a BERT transformer model on top of a bunch of annotated tweets. And we found out that actually, if you just simply do that, this model can learn some very spiral patterns and bias features, right? So the way we found out is like we're just trying to look at certain social groups or certain cultural groups, for example, and certain gender terms. And then we're trying to just apply the model on any sentences that mentioning these social group terms, like any sentence mentioning Jews. And we found out that the model become more likely to produce like a prediction of hateful content, regardless of what the content is really about, when there's a mention of the term Jews. And same thing also apply to other social group terms that we have tried, like some gender terms, for example. And this just reminds us that these models, they are not only just, I mean, even though they might look like performing decently good on some in-house evaluation data sets, but in practice, they might showing some very strange behavior that are contradicting with our human kind of criterions. And it's really problematic if we just directly deploy these systems online. So here, basically, the point I'm trying to make is like, even when you can increase the amount of labeled data for your system to learn, you might still have the issues of creating a responsible system that are robust to some neutral features rather than learning some spiral patterns. So that's kind of our starting point and the motivation for really doing this line of projects. So our kind of proposal in this line of work is trying to go from using just label to supervise a neural network model. Is we want to go into providing both the label and the label explanations to train the model all together. And there's a couple important elements here. So one thing is that, as exemplified by this instance here, so if we want to tell the model, okay, if I'm predicting that the sentiment of this sentence here is positive, I also want to tell the model the reason behind I making a prediction of positive sentiment is because I see the phrase very nice is modifying some of the target term in a sentence. Let's say the food was very nice, or the environment was very nice, right? So providing not only just the final outcome of the prediction, but also the explanations is one important aspect here. And another important aspect, or the benefits of using explanations to supervise the system, is to help the model to actually generalize much faster, right? So if your model learns that very nice, when very nice is used to modify a term, will kind of give evidence that the sentence is probably talking about some positive sentiments about this term. Then maybe in the future, when I see another sentence was also using the phrase very nice or some similar phrase like extraordinary to modify these different terms, then the system might also know that those sentences are also expressing positive sentiments towards the terms in the sentence. So that's kind of the generalization process that seems pretty straightforward for us human learners, but it's not quite explicitly models or understood in our neural network architectures. And that's exactly the gap we're trying to bridge in this line of research. So eventually, we're really looking to build up a system where the system is able to allow human annotator to provide natural language sentences describing these explanations of the prediction, in addition to just provide you the annotation results. So in this case, you can see we're asking the annotator to classify the relations between this pair of entities that are highlighted in the sentence, like this churro and these Juventus. And then after they indicate that the relations between them is like the employee of, they also write down a sentence using some pre-given templates, as you can see in the drop-down table showing here. They can select a bunch of templates, and then they can just need to fill up some slots in the templates to indicate the reasons behind those annotations. And this is the explanations we are soliciting in together with the label data, and eventually can be used to train the model in a much more efficient way, as we just talked about. So that's kind of the general idea here. I just want to dive in a bit more on defining these terminologies we just talked about in a more formal way. So when we're talking about what is an explanations in the context of natural language processing tasks, there's actually, this is actually a pretty vague term, but the way we are trying to narrow it down is to look into a few forms of explanations. The first one, which is kind of most intuitive one, is just like when you're reading a book and you are trying to make in some notes by just highlighting some sentences that you feel like it's important for you for some purpose, right? And here, if you are asking a question towards a passage about how many touchdown passes did the person throw in the second half of the game, the way you're trying to seek for the answer is really to look into the sentence and look for evidence saying this person make the first touchdown or the second touchdown, the third touchdown in different specific form of sentence, and you highlight those things, and that provides you the most direct evidence about answering the question. So that would usually be called as salient spans, and that's usually be done by using some inner working kind of attention mechanisms of the neural models to highlight these words versus the other ones. Another category of ways of the ways that people use to define explanation is what we call these like post-hoc explanations, which is derived by a family of what we call attribution explanation algorithm. They are trying to compute scores that can indicate the importance of a word or a phrase in the sentence by removing those words and phrases from the sentence and see how the model behavior change. If the model behavior change a lot after removing some word, that indicates that the word or phrase is actually pretty important to the model's prediction, and therefore they have a higher score, and those scores can be visualized as a certain heat map, like what you see at the bottom of the middle part here, and that's what we call the post-hoc explanation. And they can be done in either a flattened way or in sort of a hierarchical way to break it down. And the last category is the most general and flexible one. It's just like natural language, like how humans talk to each other when explaining things. And this is actually the most technically challenging one, because like with it seems like pretty easy for human to talk about things in a very friendly way, but still understandable between two people that are having conversations, because they can implicitly building up some common ground of the topics they are talking about, and they have a very good kind of understanding or co-reference ability when we're talking about different forms, surface names of the same entity or concept. But that's still a big challenge for the current NLP system. So you really cannot just talk very freely, but you might have some semi structure kind of explanations that are grounded to the terms in the instances as you can talk about. And that will be the focus of the rest part of the talk, which I'm gonna introduce some example works that we have done. And there you might find a more clear picture of what are the restrictions we're putting on these natural language explanations. Right, so to be a bit more formal, the specific type of natural language explanation we are looking at here is usually covering three things. Is talking about the existence of certain concepts in the input data instance. It would describe the property of the concepts, and it will also describe the interactions of the concepts, right? For example, we can still look at the left-hand side, the blue part, blue regions, where this is a sentence we need to do sentiment classification into positive or negative. So the existence of concepts could be like eye pleasing is a or like the vibrant. I think the vibe in more like a rigorous definition, the vibrant and the eyes pleasing is actually the properties or the modifiers people use to to actually describe the target concepts, which is indicated as the Moscow word term here. The term here can be a specific location, can be a particular objects we are trying to focus on, the sentence trying to focus on here. And if we find out that these properties of the concept term is actually expressing a very positive sentiments like eye-pleasing, then we believe this is a good explanations of why we classify the sentence into a positive sentiment, right? And on the right-hand side, there's a more complicated examples, which is trying to describe the interactions between the country Sweden and using the modifying terms like failure to talk about Sweden. That might indicate some sort of a hateful sentiments towards targeting Sweden. Right. So yeah, so basically we are focusing on these three kinds of particular formats that we can use in creating the explanations about the annotation here. And to be more kind of general, these explanations can be actually composed in a more complicated way. Like you can talk about what is the properties of Sweden's, and you can also talk about what is the property of another terms in the same sentence. And these two kind of atomic statements can be composed into a longer explanation sentence. So that make your explanation actually can be very complicated and long if you want, and we still hope the model can handle that. And we also have the restriction that this explanation should be more like self-contained, such that you just need this sentence itself to understand what is happening without referencing too much background knowledge or extra like common sense to do that. Because we want to make this restriction because we think that if we make the sentence too open-ended and require too much external knowledge, it might not be easy for the machines to process, even though it might seem easier for human to process. Okay, so among these definitions, we're trying to create 2 lines of work to tackle the practical problems. One line of work is trying to look into how can we take these labels together with the explanations of the labels on those instances to build a model from scratch in a very data efficient way. And there's a couple of technical challenges in this line. One is the generalization of explanations that we talked about in the previous examples, how we can technically implement that idea on these natural language explanations. And I'm going to talk about this soft rule grounding work from our papers in 2020. And we also touch on the compositionality of the explanations that possibly could be and how we can operationalize our methods to handle those compositionality. And we're going to do that by some more new modularized neural network architecture, which I'm also going to talk about. And there's also more complicated work followed up by these two, which is looking at to create explanations, not just about a single sentence, but about multiple sentences, and trying to show people the reasoning process across multiple sentences. And that's a more complicated topic, which we do have a work on that. You can find a paper in the reference list, but we're not going to cover that work today. And on another threat, we are looking at the problem where we have a model that's already been deployed and it's been running online, and the model must be making some mistakes that we can observe by doing some probing or testing. So this work is trying to look at the errors made by the model and create explanations of how to change the model behavior given we observe those errors, and to make the model perform better in the future. Right. So I'm also going to cover one work in this space that can fix the model or refine the model with the explanations we collect. All right. So regarding learning a model from scratch with the labels and human explanations, just quickly recap what kind of explanation we're looking at. So we talked about sentiment classification already, that you could basically ask the human annotator to provide a final outcome of the prediction, which is like the positive or negative, plus a sentence follow on that to talk about what is the explanation or the that consists of these concepts, the property of concepts and their interactions. Similarly, for relation extraction, we are also giving similar form of explanations, like this is the type of relation is person as nationality of the person, because I see the phrase is a appear before the second entity, and the word citizen is right after the second entity, and so on and so forth, right? So taking this sentence of explanations, what would be the possible way we can consider when building the solution of learning a model with this explanation? So there's actually some existing work done in this space in a very preliminary form. One way people could do is just to take a neural network and use that neural network to encode this natural language explanation sentence into a fixed size embedding vector. And this embedding vector will be used as part of the neural network classifiers for the sentiments. For example, in the middle layers, for example, you can append these vectors to some parts of the original sentence embedding, so that we believe that the explanation meaning was fused into the neural network classification process. And that's a very implicit and black box process, but there's some work that's showing this could possibly help. Another way you can do that is to produce a multitask learning model, where this model is asked to not only predict, let's say, the sentiment of the sentence, but also can generate an explanation using the same input, and that explanation should match the human explanations that was annotated for it. So basically, you hope that the model learn to do both prediction and making explanations for your prediction jointly, and therefore you believe that model is more generalizable. So in that sense, you are making an auxiliary task for your model. The last one is actually most kind of a straightforward way, is to take the explanations and generalize the explanations to unseen sentence instances and to create pseudo label data. And that's what we call creating noisy annotation. And that's actually the most interesting way, which we're gonna talk about more in our methods, right? So giving you a very simple workflow of how we can apply explanations to actually annotate unseen instances, right? How to operationalize these. The most important thing in this part is the parsing process. Usually when you take in a nature negative sentence, like talking about the words die, who die precede the object in the sentence by no more than 3 words and occurs between the subject and object in the sentence. When you're having these explanations, to turn it into some machine readable form, you can actually do the context-free grammar parsing, which will give you a bunch of candidate possible parts on this sentence, and you can actually learn a function to produce the most plausible parts of the explanation. And I'm not gonna dive into details of this part because there's some reference papers talking details how this can be implemented. But at the end of the day of this part, you will get what we call a pause structure for your explanation. And that part structure can be directly applied to match an instance and see if the other instances is also satisfying this pattern that you found in the sentence. So in that case, we call this parse structure also as labeling rules, right? For example, if you have a sentence talking about the price of a restaurant, and the explanations you are given to this instance is positive because the word price is directly preceded by the word fare. And now with the labeling functions I parse from this natural language sentence, I can actually do a matching of that labeling function directly to to any unlabeled instance, any sentences that doesn't have any label, and I would know that whether these labeling functions can match to some of these sentences, right? In this case, the sentence it has delicious food with a fair price can also match to this labeling function. And this is actually an example of the process, what we call explanation generalization, because the explanation you created from a source sentence also can be applied to explain and make predictions for different sentences, even though they have a slightly different language form, but the semantics or the relations between the concepts and how the price as a concept got modified by the adjective fair is very similar in these two sentences. So that's a very interesting kind of generalization that is the most essential process in this whole explanation generalization work. So now, I think the problem you can see is if you just strictly apply this labeling function, it might be very limited in terms of how many sentences it can match, right? So what we'll be thinking here is how to actually make the matching process more flexible and more generalizable. The idea we have here is basically trying to motivate. Motivated by the fact that, let's say, all these sentences are expressing very similar relations, like the organization is founded by, but they have a very slightly different surface form, like they're talking about different objects and different subjects. They are using different predicates, like founded by versus established by versus launched. So how we can close the gap of when you apply these labeling functions to different sentences, you can still get a certain matching feedback from there, right? And that's our work from the paper, where we do a very simple things is like, in addition to doing the hard match process we just talked about, which is a very strict but lack of coverage kind of a process, we also do what we call soft matching process to do all the remaining instances that cannot go through the pair match, and we're gonna produce annotations in the form of the label of the xi with a matching score, and this matching score is trying to describe the confidence of the matching that we have. For example, if your labeling rule is if the labeling rule is like the phrase was founded by is a phrase between the subject and object, then the matching to the sentence Microsoft was established by Bill Gates could be a very high confidence match, because the only difference is the predicates that was using in between these two. So they might have a 0.8 kind of matching score here. And these, both the hard match data and the soft match data will eventually be put together and used to train your downstream classifier for your relation extraction systems. So the process of the matching is actually just operationalized by a very simple attention-based weighted similarity measure. So we basically look at the attention score over each token in the pattern, and the attention score over each token in the sentence, and then do a weighted pooling to get the embedding of the labeling rule sentence, that's a ZS, and then the embedding of the sentence, that's a ZP, and then compute a cosine similarity between these two embedding vectors to get a final score. So we actually try more complicated designs like BERT-based kind of similarity measures, but it turns out it doesn't really outperform a lot. Plus, it's much slower than using this simple weighted pooling approach, because we need to do a very large scale kind of a matching by looking at every single rules in the rule set to match to every single sentence in the large amount of unlabeled sentences. So we need something that is really fast to be computed. So how does it work? It turns out that the most interesting things we found out in this work is the efficiency of how your model can quickly learn with these explanation rules, right? So what we're showing here is the annotation time you spend on annotating rules versus annotating a sentence as in the standard process. And it turns out that you can create slightly more annotated sentence in a given amount of time than creating rule, because creating rule is a little bit more creative process and takes time. But then the performance you can get for your model trained with this rule-based annotation versus the standard sentence-based annotation, it's a huge boost, as you can see by the solid blue curve versus the solid orange curve here. By spending only 5 minutes of annotation on rules, you can already get a system performing around 25-ish F1 score. And if you spend another 35 minutes to collecting rule, the system performance trained with more rules can improve to like 40% F1 score. Versus if you do this over sentence annotation and train the system with annotated sentence, the system is pretty much not working, having the performance around like a 0% F1 score. So that's really encouraging in terms of how this rule or explanation generalization can really help the model to learn in a much faster way. Right, so next we actually want to understand, is there a way to handle more complicated explanations that are compositional in the sense? So I think given the interest of the time, we're gonna quickly skim through the next just a few kind of work in a very fast way, and I will leave more time for some offline discussions and things like that. So in this case, we have an explanation sentence talking about many different statements. Like this is about, maybe it's talking about the relation, the word occurring in a certain place and another word occurring in certain other place, and the composition of these things. So to actually model that, we have what we call this neural execution tree, which consists of a bunch of functions, and each of these functions is handled in different parts of the explanation generalization process. So some are looking at whether a phrase occurs in a sentence. Some are checking whether the phrase is actually located in between a subject and object, and some are doing this logical composition like and operations or all operations. So eventually, through this compositional process, we can still produce a single matching score for each pair of natural language explanations and the unlabeled instances. So in that sense, it's the similar outcome as the rule matching process we just talked about, but now we can handle a more compositional explanation as input. So turn out that this method also works really well in terms of what we call label efficiency evaluation, where we only allocate a limited amount of time to do the annotation, but we test whether the explanation-based annotation can bring up a model that is much more effective than using the old school way of doing the annotation. And that's evident by the blue solid curve versus the remaining dash curves on this figure. Right. So lastly, I just quickly I'm trying to go through this last piece of idea, which is trying to refine the neural model through compositional explanation. And in this setting, we actually are having already a model that's already running online. For example, a hate speech detection system that is running on top of the emerging tweets and trying to predict whether a tweet is hateful or non-hateful. And what we can do is we can print out the explanation scores over these different instances as predicted by the model, and try to understand what the model currently think is the evidence of predicting hate versus non-hate, for instance. And once we identify some problematic issues, like, for example, the model is oversensitive to the term sweeten rather than using the right relationships between the modifiers of the to the sweeten to make the decision, then we can ask human annotator to write down a few sentences describing what is actually wrong about the methods and how should this be fixed by changing the color of this heat map from, let's say, red to blue or from blue to red and so on. And these explanations will be parsed into the rules as we see before and use that to actually create more annotated instances and use that to fix the model by a technique what we call explanation regularization. So the explanation regularization just works in the way that, let's say, if you want the model to put less attention to just the word sweeten, you can ask the model to decrease the attribution score on sweeten. And if you want a model to put more attention to the word failure, you can ask it to put more attention to the interactions between sweeten and failure. And that can be done by just using these regularization terms to indicate a target score for them. So all this will be then put it together with the original optimization objective of the hate speech classifier training to achieve the goal of regularizing the model with this change of the attribution score. And it turns out that this method works pretty well in terms of reducing biases of the model that can be measured by the last column of the magic FPRD here. You can see with the regularization using the SOC attribution algorithm, the bias ratio can really significantly go down from 115 to 19, for example, while maintaining the performance on a source model and also improving the F1 measures on the target task, which is the hate speech detection task here. All right, so that kind of concludes my work. I just have a few quick takeaway. I think the key ideas we want to convey to the community here is that if we can really solicit explanations about the labeling process, and these explanations can really be used to generalize to many examples that are not seen, and use that to improve the model's learning efficiency versus the conventional supervision. And these explanations also carry more information that can help you to correct the model's spiral behaviors and make the model more robust and reliable, aligned with the human values. And we also think that these model updates through this feature attribution and interaction score changes and their compositions is a very effective way. and hope that this whole new explanation-based learning can become a good paradigm for our future maintaining and constructing of NLP models. I want to thank all my collaborators, students, and really thanks to have the chance of sharing the work here. If you want to find more pointers of the work we talked about, feel free to look at our lab website, the Inc Lab at usc.edu. And also we have our GitHub repositories for all of the work we talked about today. Thank you.